Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Christina Vraunvelder. I'm the Program Manager of Open Science at the AGU. And joining me are Leslie Wyborn and Shelley Stahl. And this session is going to be about the connections that we can draw between ESIP and RDA, the Research Data Alliance. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'll be going through slides for our speakers. There are also session folder and session notes in the meeting chat. If you'd like to see any of the speaker slides or the session notes document, you can go check in there. And I'd also ask you to all please sign into the notes, leave your name and affiliation if you feel comfortable. Feel free to contribute to those session notes. And there are also some important resources for this session, especially related to some of the RDA working groups and that we'll be talking about in that session notes. So if you're looking for links, check there first. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Looks great.
Awesome. So this session is opening doors to international connections between ESIP and RDA. We'll be going for an hour and a half. And I'll briefly take you through the session structure, and then I'll hand it off to Shelley and to Leslie to give a little bit of information about what the Research Data Alliance is, why it can serve as a useful format for ESIP groups, and a little bit of a history from Leslie of the existing ESIP RDA Earth Space Environmental Science Interest Group. After that, we'll have some short talks from a few people who are active in both ESIP and RDA, Mark Parsons, Raina Jenkins, and Viv Hutchinson. And they'll be talking a little bit about the collaborative areas that they've found between ESIP and RDA, past projects, that kind of thing. At the very end of this session, Shelley will be taking us through a proposed community of practice, Earth, Space, and Environmental Science community of practice that we're trying to stand up through the RDA to strengthen these international collaborative areas that ESIP members might be interested in. Shelley has a draft of the community of practice charter for us to review and leave comments on. And as part of the wrap up and next steps, we'll have ways for you all to stay involved with that interest group, with that community of practice, if you are so interested. Shelley, do you want to come on camera, introduce yourself, and I'll go forward to your slides?
Yep, I am on camera and ready to go. So I certainly I'm old. The filters for Zoom clear my gray hair away, which I like quite a lot. But here I'm just asserting the role that I have at AGU, but really primarily leveraging that position for an international community. RDA has been important for AGU's work. ESIP has been very important for AGU's work. But one of the things that combination provides is something that's very unique. And what we're finding in the work that we're doing, answering authors' questions, meeting international researchers at the Data Help Desk, is what does it mean to actually do this internationally, and how can we leverage a platform like RDA to do that. So I am the co-chair of the RDA Organizational Assembly, and the interest group that Leslie's going to talk about in a moment, and also the Fair Data Maturity Model, and actually a few other things, but I'm just going to leave it here because that's plenty. Next slide. So these are slides that Hilary Henho provides whenever you want to talk about the broader RDA scope. So this particular version of the slide deck is aged a few months. So I'll give you a little bit of update as some of the membership counts have changed. And you'll see a lot of very complementary mission and vision when it comes to being community-driven and member-based, as ESIP also has. In this case, RDA does focus primarily on an international community. So that is something that is, ESIP has done some work internationally in the past. And there's this is one, I'm not saying the way, but a way to engage internationally through a partnership with RDA. Next slide. here is the current vision and mission. The these guiding principles are going to look very similar to ESIP's guiding principles. I did not do a comparison, but it's a rather, decent alignment. The mission for RDA, the mission is rather important. They want the interest groups in the community of practices to stand themselves up for in alignment with the mission for RDA. So whenever we try to do some sort of a partnership, it needs to align to RDA's mission as well. And if it was something that we would do ESIP and RDA, of course, both missions would need to be in alignment. Next slide. Can you hit the button 3 times, please? There's 3 types of community groups within RDA. I do have many of you have experience with at least the first 2, where working groups have a short lifespan of about a year to a year and a half working on a particular topic. Interest groups have do not have an endpoint and are stood up for a general interest. And we do have one for the Earth and Space Sciences that is something that we stood up with ESIP at the time, RDA and ESIP. And then a newer one, these community of practices are intended to be an umbrella group. So whatever your definition of community of practices, throw it out, start over. This is a very high level, discipline specific within RDA, meant to be discipline specific, and an umbrella across. For instance, let's say you can imagine all of ESIP's clusters. If you're familiar with RDA, think of their working groups. And imagine that you're taking the optics of Earth and Space Science and applying it for the benefit of researchers. In ESIP, that's not a problem. We only do Earth and Space Science. Within RDA, we actually have to put those optics on because they're multidiscipline. So next slide. There are actually over 14,000 now individuals, over 80 organizations, and the number of nations and regions is actually quite impressive. The individuals come together to learn from each other and collaborate. You can come as an individual and do nothing else, but from that point of view, as an organizational assembly member, I'm very keenly interested in the middle column. It is the only paid membership. It's one of the reasons RDA is financially stable right now, because we did make sure we had enough organizations supporting the goals of RDA and allowing individuals to continue to have free membership. That's critical. We feel that is very critical. The regions are actually a little bit complicated to talk about. The RDA Europe, in my mind, is the most active at the moment. RDA US is getting their feet back under them and moving forward. You'll see some work in 2024. Next slide, please. Just a steady, RDA celebrated 10 years in 2023 and a steady increase in membership. I think that's pretty much the most important thing to see here. Next slide. Different organization types. And one reason to call this out is ESIP really has some specific organizations that work really well to collaborate, not so much on journals and editors. So Coptis is here, but we do have, we're developing ways to work around that, which is fine. I mean, that works out just fine. And RDA actually does have a number of publishers and journals, not necessarily editors, but journals that come, and some more variety of types of stakeholders. So an opportunity to leverage those communities as well. Next slide. And I think this one goes into the same kind of thing a little bit differently. Strong representation of researchers. We've got strong librarians. What else to highlight? Oh, policy folks are also very important. It's not really coming out strongly here, but they have a funders forum. So international funders interested in data management, this is a wonderful place to be. There's also a research software alliance, and they also have a funders forum, just to mention that. RDA is very cautious to talk about that as a partnership with them. Next slide. And just another depiction of geographical distribution. You do see that the bulk of the members are in Europe. RDA is based in the UK as their financial location. Hillary is in Italy. And, you know, for instance, with AGU, you'll see the bulk of the memberships be with the US. Interesting, I just saw the numbers from December, and China was the next largest country. Very interesting for those of you who went to the leadership meeting a little bit ago. Next slide. So we have RDA 22 coming up. It will be all virtual. It is our intention to engage on within the Earth and Space Science IG on some of these same topics that we're sharing with you. So reporting back out with an RDA flavor and being very complementary with our potential ESIP partnership or growing ESIP partnership. And those are the current numbers at the top. The link to RDA, rd-alliance.org is at the bottom if you are interested in taking a look at the website. I can tell you they're going through a website redesign this year, which we're all bracing ourselves because we know website redesigns are rough. But it will be hopefully better on the other side, although it is just fine right now. Next slide. So why would ESIP want to collaborate with RDA? So I have some points here, and then hopefully our speakers that are going to be following will have some additional points. But we do have an opportunity for international awareness. If there happened to be something that ESIP was developing where it may benefit the research community to, you know, once ready to go, to get a more international feedback opportunity for international adoption, that would be a really great opportunity to take that to RDA. You do have access to different types of stakeholders for that sort of feedback. You can get those in other ways too. So I'm not saying this is the only way. And then one of the nice things about having a little bit of promo for the organizational assembly is they are the adopters. The organizations that have researchers that participate in RDA are primarily the adopters for the recommendations generated. So that would be true if ESIP wanted to take something to RDA, you would have an opportunity to reach out to those adopters and share that work and give them a chance to have questions asked. And then there's some, you can reiterating some of those examples below. Next slide. So how would we do this? So there are a couple options. We already have the ESIP RDA Earth, Space, and Environmental Science Interest Group. So Leslie's going to talk about that in a moment. Always, and we do support this now, that any ESIP cluster could bring a recommendation or output from that cluster and share it at the IG with no additional work whatsoever. And that would be wonderful. That alone would be brilliant and fantastic and welcome. All you need to do is contact one of the co-chairs, so Leslie or myself, and we have other co-chairs as well, Danny Kincaid and Helen Glaves. And the other option is we can actually stand up if you're interested in having one of the recommendations coming from ESIP, we could actually stand up a working group that would further explore the relationship that an RDA community would have. So perhaps new versions would come out of that with additional feedback and opportunities for discussion and conversation. So 12 or 18 months for that to happen. And then later in this talk, I'll actually talk about the community of practice being a platform where some of these conversations can also have, but they can happen right now with the IG as well. Next slide. I think I'm coming to the end. Yes, okay. If you have questions, it's possible that the upcoming speakers might be answering them. So perhaps we should hold on questions unless there's a burning clarification or such.
I don't see any raised hands.
Susan
Um,
has the core values, so they're certainly not in conflict. I don't know that they align perfectly, but they're certainly not in conflict.
Thanks, Shelley. That was really helpful, especially the breakdown of the interest group versus community of practice. Before we move on to Leslie, I want to ask Susan, do you want to jump in here and make any remarks?
No, I actually want to hear I want to hear the rest of the speakers before sometimes when I speak up, I like tip the scales one way or another. I'd rather just let it evolve more organically, but thanks for the opportunity.
I
We'll come
will
back to that later
definitely
then.
come back to Susan in the community of practice. So Susan, you can keep writing notes if you want to. But we are delighted that Susan, we did invite Susan to come and participate, certainly as a listener in this session. And we're really glad she was able to do that because she of course is important for coordination here.
All right. Thanks, Shelley. We'll hold questions, as Shelley just mentioned, and move on to Leslie, who's going to give us a history of the ESIP RDA Earth, Space, and Environmental Science Interest Group.
Thanks, Christina. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So there's a couple of links, but next slide, please. Before I go too much further, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the traditional owners of the lands on which I come to you from today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. Next. Okay, so I've just got two rather full slides here to say that we've been quite an active group in RDA, and here are all the sessions. Now, if you get these slides and these links, you can kind of see what we've been discussing at each one of the RDA plenaries. Next slide, please. And so down here at the bottom is where we started, which was in September 2017. And we actually became, which is record time for me, an interest group in RDA by the 11th plenary in March 2018. And so really we've been going 5 years. It is time to review what we're doing and where we're functioning. And we're kind of at a tipping point. I would argue that at the Salzburg meeting in October, we agreed that the interest group would move into the community of practice, which we're kind of up for discussion today later on what that's going to be like. Next. Okay, so how do we get started? Led by, whoops, bad spelling mistake, Mohan and Kirsten. It was initially about EarthCube seeking international partnerships at this BOF at Montreal. At that meeting, these other groups, Ozscope, Envy, EPOS, OGC, EDI, USGS, AGU, turned up. And what we kind of suggested was rather than extending EarthCube internationally, we set up an interest group that's more about connecting the global Earth cubes. At the same time, the AGU Enabling Fair Data Project was wrapping up and had moved to ESIP and become the cost desk cluster. Erin, who was then ED of ESIP, suggested that the IG, as Shelley talked about, could be a place where ESIP clustered could test and validate international interest in their topics or their recommendations, like the internal recommendation documents that are endorsed by ESIP, and road test them. And so it became the ESIP RDA ESCSIG in March 2018. And the first chairs were Erin, Shelley, Helen, and myself. Next. So, what does the group actually do? And we work towards coordinating and harmonizing multiple international efforts. Again, as I said, the Earth Cubes internationally, both in interdisciplinary and domain-specific fair infrastructure development, vocabs, and common services. We seek to reduce the duplication, increase efficiency, share use cases, promote partnerships, and then adoption of recommendations in the community. And so, in essence, were about sharing information on projects, highlighting who's doing what where to try and avoid duplication, and, if you like, increase the size of the communities that are using the same standards and guidelines so that we can get greater greater sharing with wider communities. Next. We also run 2 crowdsourced catalogues, and you've got the connections to them there. And one is just this organic list. Every time I look at it, someone seems to add something, which work within ESES or work within ESES as part of cross-domain infrastructures. And we've also got a catalogue where we're starting to compile vocabularies, ontologies, just people that are working on semantic type standards. And anyone's welcome to visit and add to them. Next. One of the things that we also are trying to do, because we take an international focus, is connecting to the global south. And we found it really hard in RDA. And I think that Shelley had a map in her her presentation on where the RDA members are. And I think you'll notice a bit of a correlation. And so what we found is that we really need to focus on those combined RDA IDW meetings where CODATA comes in, like the one at Salzburg, because you'll actually find the Global South participates much more in CODATA-like activities. However, we have achieved that when Erin left ESIP, she stepped down as being a chair, and Pedro from Brazil came in and is now one of our co-chairs. So we've got someone from the Global South. But the important thing is we're a bottom-up group. We want to leverage activities and stop reinventing the wheel. Next. So basically, we mainly meet at the plenaries to share information. We don't really hold meetings in between the plenaries. And we have 2 types of presentations, lightnings and deep dives. And the lightning section is an open invite for anyone to announce, this is my project, this is what I'm doing. And then if there's sufficient interest, we will ask you to come back and do a deep dive. And ESIP clusters have used, can you go back, to take their work to international audiences and road test whether they can take their work further and form a spin-off or just connect to equivalent RDA groups. And the advantage of doing that through ESESIG is that it stops, you don't have to go and set up your own BOF and get your own thing. You can sort of use this community to test the water. And so, for example, Rama and Peng took the information quality. That was very good. We had the chance to set up a working group to continue that work that's been going on in ESIP internationally, but unfortunately none of us had the bandwidth. More successful is Danny's group, which has got an incredibly long title. I just call it Pub to Repo, where she's trying to develop a workflow that connects publishers to repositories, and that will be talked about in the CopDesk session on Friday. And then there are other ESIP RDA connections totally independent of our group, and Mark will discuss these. Next. Can you go back one, please? Okay, so I just wanted to show how it kind of works, and you can see how Danny's Pub to Repo started out with CDF. We brought it to ESIP. It was quite successful, but we thought we needed a broader audience, so we went to RDA. And you can see how we've been sort of oscillating between ESIP and RDA. And right now we're on the verge of spinning off a working group. Again, this will be discussed on Friday. Danny needs more help to be able to get that going. But again, it's another idea of how something that was hatched in ESIP has now gone to a broader stage. Next. So where does ESIP fit in? As I said, it was decided that we'll merge into the COPDES and cease to exist, but I'm not sure when this will happen. Does ESIP want to continue the connections between the ESIP clusters and the proposed ESIG? And then the current issue also is that note, and again, this is historical from decisions made in 2018, we were branded as the ESIP RDA ESIG. Okay, so I've just put this last slide in about half an hour ago. Can you go to the next one, please? I doubt we'll have the COP up and running by the next plenary, which is May. Sessions proposals are due 13th of February. Please contact me if you'd like to highlight your ESIP work at this plenary, and we'll see if we can get you on the program. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Leslie. Does anyone have any questions for Leslie or Shelley before we go on to our short talks from other speakers? And if you think of anything, feel free to drop your questions in the chat as well, and we'll come back to it after our next group of speakers. So next up, we have a series of short talks from folks who have been involved in collaboration between ESIP and RDA. Firstly, Mark Parsons, who many of you will know has worn many hats, one of them being as the first Secretary General of the Research Data Alliance. So Mark, I'm going to go ahead and start with your slides, and let me know when you'd like to move between them.
Go back one. Okay, thanks. You all can hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I was asked to talk about the RDA ESIP relationship. I think this is because I have a good view into both organizations. I was one of the founders of RDA when it began back in 2013. And as Kristen mentioned, I was the first Secretary General. I'm a longtime active participant in ESIP. I was an elected board member for 4 years. I've been a cluster chair. I helped launch the stewardship committee. I was on Susan's hiring committee, so on. So all that said, I currently have no governance role in either organization. So this is just my personal perspective. And perhaps even better, I was lucky to have lunch with some old friends last week who were very active in how ESIP and RDA collaboration got going back in the day. So Aaron Robinson, the former ESIP executive director, and Lynn Yarmy, who many of you probably know, who is the former RDA community director. And Lynn sends her regards to all of you. Okay, so next slide. So first off, I think RDA and ESIP are collaborating wonderfully. And we've been working on this since RDA was established back in 2013. I think there was a session at ESIP in 2014. The first RDA formally launched February 2013 in Sweden. The next meeting was in Washington, D.C. in September. And then there was the usual ESIP January meeting, and I think we were already talking about it. The Preservation and Stewardship Committee, I know, initially identified liaisons. They were really trying to focus on how to do this, but that sort of formality ebbed. But Lynn Yarmy and Mark Parsons produced some important works around 2016 that you all should check out. Lynn gave a great talk at AGU, and then we had a poster at ESIP in 2017. And if you could actually click on the building community capacity one, yeah, let's go look at that poster real quick. And zoom into the like upper left corner. Yeah, that's good enough. Hope you all can see that. So the basic theme that we were talking about is, as we all know, whoop, no, too much. Go back a little bit. This was, yeah, there you go. I want to focus on global challenges require global solutions, but investment is often local. This is something that we struggle with all the time, is that we want to work global problems, but our structures are inherently structured locally. And so the point that we're trying to really get across is that we need to play across multiple scales at the same time. This is this concept called glocalism or globalization. And there's a nice quote there. But the idea is that you're addressing both the local and the global at the same time. And then what this means is that just constant collaboration. And then if you zoom in sort of to the middle, to that sort of arrowy figure down at the bottom, this is a great figure that really Lynn came up with. I modified slightly, that shows how it's this ongoing iterative process between the global and local, and that there's these various steps along the way, interpreting, reporting, negotiating, documenting, and each step is an opportunity for collaboration. And I think RDA helps with that, and ESIP certainly helps with that, but at different scales. So I just wanted to give you all this information way back from 2016, 17 to just acknowledge that we've been thinking about this and that it's been working actually pretty well. So go back to the slides. And so ESIP has been thinking about this from the get-go. The ESIP board wrote a white paper on international collaboration, not just talking about RDA, but how ESIP fits into the global landscape. And all of this, I think, is the foundation for some of the work that Leslie just described. And also, I think it's really important to note that there's always been a good number of ESIPers participating in RDA. It's just the nature of ESIPers. They like to collaborate. But then also, I think we've brought, I wouldn't call them RDAers, but we've brought more of the international community into what ESIP is doing and highlighting sort of the important work we're doing. So go ahead to the next slide. So, and we've seen this working. So ESIP clusters, so I see it coming from two different directions, and I think both Shelley and Leslie hinted at this or even talked about this. So that on the one hand, ESIP clusters can broaden the influence of the work that they're doing through RDA. They can bring it to a larger international audience. They can bring it to an audience beyond Earth science. And these are just some examples that just came off the top of my head. The drones cluster in ESIP got a lot of extension through RDA. The poster that we just looked at talks about that a little bit. The samples group, I think, had similar success. Leslie can certainly talk about that in great detail. Schema.org, science on schema.org, I think, is one of the highlighting examples. This is a project that just started as an NSF project. They decided to make it an ESIP initiative, which really extended its scope, and then they brought it to RDA, and now we see it in the UN Ocean Decade. We see it in global efforts around polar data sharing. I think it's been a huge success. I think data quality is similar. I think Leslie or maybe Shelley mentioned that there was an awesome session at the International Data Week last fall, bringing together these communities. Looking at it from the other way, though, I think that ESIP guidance has built from the knowledge from RDA. ESIP has recommendations on how to cite Earth science data sets. It's, I think, been one of our more influential recommendations, and it explicitly references and recommends a recommendation within an RDA on dynamic data citation. I mentioned scienceonschema.org, and they've explicitly mentioned the IADOT standard that came out of RDA. You know, FAIR is everywhere. That's the buzzword. And I think that collaboration is really happening as well. So in other words, I think this is locality in practice. This is what's really happening. Go ahead to the next slide. So when RDA started back in 2013, it had a fair amount of attention. Multiple agencies and governments were making new coordinated investment, and it caught a lot of people's attention, and not always in a positive way. There were definitely some turf issues. Various groups like ESIP, I don't think ESIP was one of them, were doing similar things to RDA, felt threatened. And I don't think ESIP felt threatened. Erin confirmed that she didn't think that ESIP felt threatened. But they did need to figure out, okay, there's this new kid on the block that's actually trying to bring people together from around the world. How do we work together? And ESIP wasn't the only organization that was trying to do this. And so a common approach, as you saw in Leslie's talk, was naming working groups and interest groups as being jointly affiliated. You know, the RDA, ESIP, Earth and Space Sciences interest group is the classic example. So, you know, sometimes even 3 affiliations. But I think that the group that was sort of the poster child for collaboration that I think led to this concept of community of practice was the agricultural group. And they, I think, really did a great job of disabusing this notion of turf. Ag data is really inherently political, and groups like the FAO always have to tread carefully. But so RDA gave them the place where they could collaborate in this sort of neutral space. So all this is to say, to lead to the first bullet here, is that any sort of central facilitation, like a community of practice, needs community buy-in. And so the community of practice needs to explicitly recognize their contributors. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be joint branded. You know, maybe this is the NASCAR slide, you know, heavy use of acknowledgements. There's other ways to do this. Because I think on the flip side, organizations need to recognize that building infrastructure, if it's really good infrastructure, you disappear. Nobody knows you exist. You just flip the switch and the lights turn on, and nobody thinks about all the people that made that happen. And I'm running out of time, but I want to get to this next bullet. And this is a paraphrase from Lynn again. Yes, you got to play the game. In other words, you have to work with people. You got to keep things going. You got to play the organizations, but you also have to get things done. And I think RDA working groups are a good way to do that. They're short term. They focus your attention. You can tick a box and say that you actually did something. And so I think that's something that as we work towards a community of practice that we need to think about is how to build really targeted working groups. Principles make it easier to make difficult decisions. So ESIP and RDA have both of those. Openness is always good. Friction is going to happen. It's necessary. It's actually a good thing as long as it's not rooted in power dynamics. And I think, fortunately, ESIP is not a power dynamic sort of organization. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone have a question for Mark before we move on to the next presentation?
Just a really quick comment. Mark, thank you. That I'm making notes in the community of practice charter saying summarize Mark's point here. So attribution to Mark, make sure, just so you know.
And Lynn.
And Lynn and Aaron, who's here. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, just
Excellent.
catching
Thank
up
you,
with my
Mark.
chat. Yes, Lindsay and Andrea were awesome on the drone stuff. And Jane.
So,
All right, talk more later. Ciao.
So Raina Jenkins will be speaking next a little bit about her work with both ESIP and RDA. And among other, sorry, I'm just trying to bring up my notes document here. I've got a lot of windows up. Among other things, Raina is right now the director for the World Data System International Technology Office and has been involved in various ESIP and RDA things. The one that I know of her from is being the co-chair of the Data Granularity Working Group. So thank you, Raina, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you now. And let me know when you'd like to change your slides.
Okay. Oh, well, yeah, there we start. Okay. I guess you can just hop past this one. I'm going to be doing a bit of an overview background on the World Data System just for some context, and then jump into some of the experience that we've had with ESIP and RDA and potential ways of working together. And I apologize, I'm losing my voice a little bit, to a bit of a sore throat, so just bear with me. So to get started, I have first of all, land and sea acknowledgement, because the World Data System International Technology Office is based at the University of Victoria in BC in Canada. And so we therefore acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Osaanich people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I should also mention that I'm currently working remotely and in the area of the Malahat First Nation. But of course, we're all representatives of the data community, and in particular, World Data System with the data repository community. So we wanted to also just highlight the importance of the CARE principles. Next slide. So the World Data System, it's an affiliate organization of the International Science Council, started in 2009. And currently our science committee is chaired by David Castle, and we have an national multidisciplinary science committee overall. The International Program Office is currently in Tennessee, and that's directed by Meredith Goins. Like has already been mentioned, I'm chairing the office in Victoria. And right now we have about 125 members internationally. Now these are, the regular members are the core of what we have, which is the data repositories. But we also have network, partner, associate, and candidate members, which are different flavors of members all in the data repository ecosystem. Next slide. So overall, the mission of the World Data System is to enhance capabilities, impact, and sustainability of our membership. And so we have three main ways. So this is all very much aligned with ESIP and RDA really, but created trusted communities of scientific data repositories, strengthening that scientific enterprise throughout the life cycle of data, and advocating for accessible and transparent and reproducible science. Next slide. So right now we're in a 2-year action plan. This is our second year, just starting out. And we have 4 objectives that we've been working on. So the first is to provide services and support to our members. Second is to develop value narratives for the World Data System members. And this is partly just to allow for sustainability and increased funding. Also to provide global leadership and agenda setting, and to enhance access, quality, and accessibility of data worldwide. Next slide. So to do that, we do partner with ESIP and RDA. So we'll start with ESIP and some of our highlights. So we've been involved in a number of clusters over the years, and here I'm highlighting some of the more recent ones. So the scienceonschema.org was a really important cluster for work that we did on the polar data search, also known as the Federated Data Search, but it's being renamed currently. And we're embarking on some collaborative work with Otis as well. The semantic harmonization group was also helpful for the polar data search work and other polar working groups. And currently I'm just starting getting involved into the data readiness group because we're trying to apply that checklist to the membership repositories. We're planning a workshop this spring and going to see how we can get feedback and improve on that checklist over time. And this is regarding AI data. And I'm also just starting to attend the Council for Data Facilities meetings. So there's an obvious parallel here. And CopDesk is is another of the groups that is really central to our interests. So next slide. So just like this one, we've attended numerous ESIP meetings over the years and are beginning to help more with the data help desk. We've contributed to the help desk and we hope to do so more in the future. And ESIP is a partner member of the World Data System today. Next slide. Now, in terms of the RDA, we've been involved in many of the interest groups and the working groups. And here is just a list, but the list goes on beyond what's here. So Meredith Goins is very much involved with some of the repository certification groups like the interest group and the trust principles and adoption working group. She's co-chair of both. Then we have CJ, who is chair of or co-chair of the Global Open Research Commons interest group and the working group that just completed its outputs in October. And I am also a co-chair of a working group on data granularity, as mentioned by Christina. And Meredith also sits on the RDA US Steering Committee. Another interesting example is the Research Metadata Schema Working Group, because this had a lot of interaction with the SOSO cluster. So that's an example of some cross-fertilization, but also really important for the polar work that was done. Before I came to World Data System, I worked at Ocean Networks Canada, and there I had the experience of being one of the early adopters of the data citations working group outputs on dynamic data. And so that was really valuable, essential really, to figure out a strategy for citation at ONC. So there's many more experiences that we've had. More recently, we've been really pleased about the RDA Tiger support, which allows us to have services for facilitation, communications, or even last mile output support for the working groups. And as a chair, I can tell you that this is a huge improvement, just helps with all the little details of running a group that allows you to put more effort into the actual group activities. Next slide. Also with the RDA, we partner together on International Data Week. So this is every couple of years. It was most recently in Salzburg, and we're looking forward to, in 2 years' time, well, I guess 1.5 years' time, Brisbane and Cape Town, even further down the road. So these started back in 2016. And basically, it's a melding of the RDA plenary and the World Data System and CODATA Sciditagon conferences, and putting those together. And I'm actually on the program committee this year. We're just starting to figure out the theme. So if you have brilliant ideas, let me know. And in addition to that, of course, the plenaries are attended by staff regularly. And RDA is an associate member of the World Data System. So next slide. So in doing some thinking, there's some obvious ways that the two entities can work together. The cross exchange of outputs is really key. So just an example, we have CJ, who I mentioned, led the GORC working group in the RDA, and he'll be presenting at the Council for Data Facilities meeting in March. So we should encourage this cross adoption of outputs. And I think it was mentioned by Shelley about the new revisal of the website for RDA. So I know that a lot of work has gone into thinking about the semantics and tools for identifying all the relevant outputs from the community. And so I think the semantics and the tools for interoperability related to these outputs is a really important area that groups like ESIP and RDA can collaborate on, especially the semantics. And then this was already mentioned about presenting ESIP results at the RDA plenaries, but I would also suggest the International Data Week is even broader, gives an even broader reach, but of course it's not as frequent. And we did have an example of that from the last IDW with the AI checklist from the data readiness group. Next slide. Cross-promotion is another avenue for collaboration. So the data help desk is one area for help gaining more volunteers. That could be requested through RDA, especially at some of the more international conferences and sites where they're going to have the help desk. The dissemination of new clusters and working groups could also be promoted, and or advertising any of the endorsed outputs. There's certainly a shared mission across the two groups, so they should continue to work together where possible. So one avenue I was thinking about was the RDA Funder Forum. When they meet, they should also not just be aware of what RDA is doing, but also what ESIP is doing, and have that vantage point of what funding needs there are from the ESIP community. And I think this is really important for us all to think about more, is this fulfillment of the data-dependent needs for the international challenges we face, the Ocean Decade, the SDGs, and so forth. And how can we also work together on really raising the awareness about data at large-scale international events like the COP events for climate change or for biological diversity. And I don't know if this happens already, but in the establishment of new groups or clusters, maybe there should be some cross-checking if there's already some relevant working group, just checking for duplication of efforts between the ESIP and RDA, and just combine them when both entities are appropriate. Next slide. Great, so that's my main points. But I also really agree that the ESIS interest group is a great way for ESIP outputs to be promoted and bring it to that international reach. Thank you. And sorry for my voice.
Thank you so much, Raina. I think I can speak for us all when I say that I appreciate you joining us despite the voice, and I hope it feels better soon because it sounds painful. So that was great. Thank you for illustrating some of the overlaps between RDA and ESIP and the WDS and International Data Week, which I had the pleasure of attending in Salzburg. Does anyone have a question for Raina before we move on to Viv?
Thank you, Raina. That was fantastic.
All right, I'll go ahead and have our last speaker, Viv. I'll be going through her slides again. And Viv is joining us from the USGS, where she is the branch chief for science data management in the Science Analytics and Synthesis program. So take it away, Viv. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks so much for having me. I guess, yeah, like I was just introduced, I do work for the USGS. I've been about 20 years in federal government. I actually just moved into a new role. I'm now called the Senior Data Advisor at USGS, and I work directly for the Associate Chief Data Officer in the Geological Survey. And so, that just means kind of having an understanding of our data policies and developing data strategies and sort of figuring out how we can continue to build capacity to best share our scientific data among our stakeholders. And so over the years, I've been quite involved in building the USGS community for data integration with Leslie Shee. Some of you may know her. She's a very big participant in ESIP. And I've been involved in ESIP over the years and most recently RDA. So I guess the next slide, please. So, you know, USGS is just one federal agency within a huge federal government that really works consistently on the national and international level. Many agencies and bureaus do this. And I just wanted to highlight what our international program webpage talks about in terms of the importance of international collaborations and communities. It just says that over the coming decades, profound environmental and societal trends will challenge governments, administrators, and societies with increasingly complex policy decisions. And preparing for these changes will require reliable data and information that are inherently global in nature and need international collaboration in order to make scientific progress. So I just thought that was kind of important to point out that these sort of cross communications that we can make are incredibly important, and they allow us to sort of share approaches and conclusions and lessons learned, and explore new ideas from a potentially vastly different perspective when we go international with these things. So the next slide. Certainly, the broader federal government works at the international level. There's so many examples of that, right? I mean, even just like collaborating on the International Space Station, you know, things like this is just world-class research in space. But, you know, USGS works internationally, sort of in particular, like as an example, saving lives from natural disasters. And so, you know, scientists in our volcano hazards program and their counterparts worldwide sort of work together to improve volcano monitoring and eruption warning schemes to evacuate people from towns and villages and passive distress. So this all kind of takes a community effort and sharing of data and resources and that type of thing around the globe. And then just to point out that, of course, you know, science data topics have become really more prevalent in recent years, and data management, sharing of data, sort of the concept of FAIR and open data and open science, and all of this is sort of becoming normalized in the science community. So I just took a perspective on that for this talk to kind of delve into where I've seen some overlap in the conversations that are going on locally and globally. So the next slide. I just did this kind of quick comparison of topics in recent conferences at ESIP and RDA and the USGS Community for Data Integration, just underlined and bolded related themes that were themes for these meetings. And, you know, there's obviously a clear overlap in what international communities are interested in talking about and collaborating on. Next slide. And then in the next couple of slides, oh, yeah, the next slide there, thanks. Yeah, in these next couple of slides, I just listed the topics that were in agendas from ESIP and RDA and the Community for Data Integration at USGS, and sort of color-coded them, finding a lot of overlap in conversations that are taking place within those groups. There's overlap on nearly every topic, which means there's great interest in sharing information and lessons learned and ideas for the evolution of these areas. And so, you know, some examples are the use of artificial intelligence in science, for example. This was listed as a topic multiple times in conference agendas and in all three of the recent agendas. Other examples, and you can flip to the next slide, just include data citation and vocabulary services, FAIR data, imagery data, how we're storing and accessing that, collaborative data tools, this type of thing. So anyway, I just kind of generated that as and just sort of to show that overlap and how much interest there is across these communities. Next slide. So I think here I just have probably an outdated piece of information about the interest group that overlaps. I guess that's taking on a new life, which is fantastic. But I do think, you know, the focus on coordination for these topics that overlap the communities are important. And just ensuring that cross participation from leadership of these communities to communicate ideas and activities from the groups. I think intentional communication here on the direction and challenges and approaches that each of the groups are discovering is kind of critical to be sharing. And obviously, we've seen some excellent examples from the other speakers in this session about how that's being done today. Next slide. So then I just kind of reflected in a closing slide here about, I just went to my first RDA in the last year, as well as International Data Week. And so both of those were fantastic experiences. And, as I've mentioned, USGS has been a longstanding member of the ESIP community as well. And so, I attended those meetings because the topics that were being presented were directly related to the work that I do every day. And so that's really important, right, in federal service to have that connection to your own work. And nearly every one of those sessions is a topic that's relevant to how USGS is implementing open science and open data and FAIR, and really gave me concrete examples of work happening in other countries and other federal agencies in the US that I can communicate results from back to my bureau. And that's important because we don't want to be working in a vacuum on these data issues. And so just interoperability across data and data sharing opportunities are really only implementable if we have shared approaches and standards and that kind of thing, hence the importance of these conversations. And so in my role as the senior data advisor, I'm really cognizant about issues and challenges in implementing federal requirements, such as our public access plans that require our data and publications to be made available with no embargo coming up here. We're working on approaches in our bureau and USGS to establish data sharing agreements for sensitive data, and ensuring all culture in USGS, continues to grow towards open and FAIR and repositories that support FAIR and that kind of thing, and how we can be more inclusive in our science. And so I saw all of that kind of reflected in these recent conferences that I participated in. I guess the challenge I see is sort of the reality of attending that conference and getting excited, returning to work with lots of new ideas and things to share. And then, you get back to reality with email and projects and the dailies that go on. And so just ensuring that we have that continued conversation at the local level, as well as up to the global level, as Mark was mentioning, is, I think, a really sort of a thoughtful way that we can be intentional about learning from our colleagues. So anyway, these topics and more really drive me as a federal employee to these conferences and these conversations where I can bring back ideas for implementation in USGS and, keep us from reinventing a wheel. So anyway, those are some kind of high level thoughts about next steps for ESIP and RDA, but I think it's a fantastic thing to continue to push. So, and the next slide is just the last one. Thank you.
And thank you, Viv. That was great. And I think the perspective from a federal agency where it can be potentially difficult to make those international connections is great. I also want to highlight that both you and Mark have mentioned this, the idea of coming back to reality and needing something to keep you on track after all those great ideas that were sparked at RDA or at ESIP. So something to keep in mind as we talk about a community of practice, which doesn't necessarily provide the same deadline-oriented work as a working group. So I would like to pause here and see if anyone in the audience has questions for any of our speakers before we move on to the next section, where we'll be discussing the proposed community of practice and having Shelley answer specific questions about that. Does anyone have a question? I'm sure that they're saving them all the good questions for you, Shelley.
I have no doubt, and they are not shy. So one thing I want to, I'm not sure we did this on purpose, Christina, but all of our speakers are organizational speakers. So the World Data, so ESIP, starting with ESIP. ESIP is a member of RDA's organizational assembly. USGS is a member of RDA's organizational assembly, and World Data System is affiliate member of RDA's organizational assembly. So thank you. Just want to let that sit for a second. All right, well, let's get going. I'm sure there's opportunity to have more conversation. Yeah, ESIP is an organizational member. Susan joined. Yes, yes. You can go on their website and see.
Okay, I believe you. I just I think that's actually relevant because back in the day when I was running things, we wondered about organizations like ESIP being organizational members, and the issue was that ESIP wasn't international enough. That
Oh,
no, don't give that face.
yeah, sorry.
Um, Rather, and I don't think it was necessarily a good point, but the point was that there's presumably many national organizations doing RDA type things, and the original concept, which may well have changed, of organizational members was organizations doing RDA like things. And so if you're doing it at a national level, you're inherently not doing it like an RDA thing. So my point is I think this may actually be a good thing. That as you're establishing a community of practice should incorporate many organizational members. And that's maybe what makes it a little bit different from an interest group. So yeah, all right, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we just had a board meeting for the organizational assembly, and one of the blessings of an organization that's not too old is that the founding members still exist and they can help you. I was lamenting as the co-chair as to why a certain thing was the way it was, and it can be confusing. And then I was reminded, schooled, whatever you want to call it, on how it got to be that way and why everyone likes the fact that it evolved and was no longer that same way. And I think there were many years where there were no new organizational assembly members. And I think it's because there may have been, as you just said, you may just have solved a problem for me, some sort of a idea of who that should be. And right now it's wide open. It's, if you're interested in that kind of conversation, you are welcome.
You're interested and willing to pay the dues.
That's right. That's right. But we put it in a frame, not unlike how Susan talks about where the funding comes for ESIP. We put it in a framework of, your members come from your organizations, there's value in their attending. This is a way for you to give back. This is a way for you to help support what's happening. It's a it's meant to be a value add proposition. So but you don't have to be, right? It's not required to come. So that is also true. So if an organization wants to support the community of practice, they are welcome, period, if they're an organizational member or not. It does not matter. So let's dig in on this. And I am very appreciative that all of these talks have come, because I think you're framing the good, you're highlighting the risk areas. And I made some notes within the document while you were all talking to try to remind myself to go back and flesh out some of those, especially the risk areas. Christina, there's a few slides, if you don't mind hopping through those quickly. So this is the link, and I'll ask you to click it, but just not yet. Hang on, one more slide. before you go forward. There we go. Yes. Okay. Just we did earlier last year have an interest meeting on the community of practice where we invited a bunch of people, a couple different time zones. We had a really good feedback. There was a form that we filled out, and I'll admit that I think there was more rhetoric in the form than there was in the meeting. The meeting was rather short. And for those of you who recall the meeting, you're like, well, it didn't seem that positive, but if you looked at the response in the form, it was quite positive. And then in plenary 21, we did have an early discussion on what that would look like. We talked about, do we keep the IG as well as a community of practice? And, to be quite honest, at that time, I had not thought about that, but then I did talk to the folks. There's only one other community of practice, and that is the ag folks that Mark was talking about earlier, agriculture data, and they in fact did close down their IG when they stood up their community of practice. And their primary reason for doing so is the overlap was in totality, and there wasn't enough leaders to run both. And they did not see it being a detriment to make the change. So at the moment, we're leaning towards dissolving the IG and just, doing a Phoenix moment and and standing up the CO and the community of practice. We still have to get through approval, but I don't see that being an issue. The skids are a bit greased. There is a high desire for a second community of practice to come in, and a lot of curiosity. Hard to stand one up. So the staff at RDA staff and the council are hearing I'm reiterating salient points from our conversations, so they understand why we're taking our time to consider this. Okay, so, and there continues to be a strong desire to move forward. Oh, hang on a minute. I'm not looking at the chat.
It's okay, Shelley. Mark and I are just continuing our debate.
Okay. Right,
like we always do.
I'm going to close the chat down. Otherwise, I think I'll continue my distraction. Okay. Could we open up the draft document? I will. Oh, Erin has her hand up. Hi, Erin.
Hey, I just had a question about staffing. Does the community of practice come with additional staff, with some kind of staff support?
No, but my intention was to go after funding to get a community manager to help.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, they're not tied together. And partly, gosh, Raleigh's here. Hey, Raleigh. Hey, Raleigh. We talked about this. Partly, one, I don't want them to be like at the hip, but it is very clear that in order for something larger than our IG to be healthy, it needs at least part-time community manager support.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, Kirsten.
Yeah, hi. And I apologize. I came in late because I was in a different session before. My question is just as I heard the, terminating the IG in favor of the community of practice, who decides, who has the decision-making power for terminating an interest group? Is that just the leadership of RDA?
No, we do. The group does.
The group does. Okay. So there would be a vote, or I'm just thinking of the process. Has that happened, or?
No, it's pending. It's there's not a decision that's made. Leslie, I've not taken a look at the interest group charter and governance documents. I would have to go look to actually check on the exact mechanism.
I can't remember, but I've just put in the chat, the current IG cannot expand anymore, or we need different leadership because it's totally volunteer, and the people running it are overcommitted. We struggle to get the sessions up, although we do get them up. But like there's been talk of expanding more and bringing under the umbrella environmental groups and connecting better with, say, marine and that. So I thought that at the last DSCS IG in Salzburg, where we discussed this, there seemed to be general consensus amongst the audience there. Let's get on with this. Let's stop talking about it. Let's go into the COP. But again, I guess we'd have to check the rules and regulations as to whether we need a formal vote. I mean, there are a lot of people subscribed to the group and to the sessions we hold, but I guess we haven't tested it with everyone who's in the group. So
Not yet.
good point.
Yep. And I'm happy to do that. I mean, I would support that, certainly. Yeah. So I have it written down as an action. I don't know, Christine, if you've got notes going or something that I'm happy to check on it. Christina, do you want me to share my screen? Maybe I should. Maybe I'll do that. Okay.
Go ahead, Shelley. And for everyone else, if you'd like to follow along, the link to the Community of Practice Agreements has been dropped in the chat, and I'll do it again right here.
I'm gonna some of the sections I'm going to skip because we discussed them at the last plenary and you all weighed in, and you'll have an opportunity to read the document. Should you not need, have some trouble falling asleep tonight, this is an opportunity to use the document to help you in this way. Of course, I say that kiddingly. So for this conversation, so I have the outline on the left. If your Google doesn't have that going, you please do enable that. It will walk you through each of the sections. In the last plenary, we talked, actually, maybe I should cover the last plenary. In the last plenary, we talked about, does it make sense to keep the discipline, so this would be a change from the IG, keep the discipline space of space and planetary. And we said, no, actually, we would tighten it up for just Earth and environmental. So that would be a difference and would need to be highlighted for the decision to close the IG. It is a change. That can be reversed. We can put space back in. Just we're not done. But that was that conversation. The other conversation.
Shelley,
Yep.
I'd just like to add, the word space has caused terrible confusion in RDA.
Go ahead.
In
Yeah.
ESIP and AGU, space means outer space, cosmic everything. In RDA, space meant geospatial.
Yeah, we had to answer that.
That's the issue.
Yep. Yep. And as Mark was talking about ruffled feathers, our geospatial folks in RDA had definitely ruffled feathers. And I do believe it was Leslie who did all of the connections to clarify in the description of the IG, talk to the tab, and make sure, everybody was peeled off the ceiling. No, it's all right, all is well. So it's also true that RDA does not have a strong planetary and space presence. So that is a difference between ESIP and RDA. So the second thing we talked about in the last plenary were the objectives. And what I did is I took those notes and I summarized them here. I gave everyone who was attending all of the general objectives that were being recommended for a community of practice, and then specific ones that have come up within our work within the IG. This is a longish list. This is a combination of those two that were upvoted from, many of them were upvoted, by the way. There's just a few that fell off. Interestingly, nobody voted for data citation work, which is humorous. But it's not that we can't talk about it. It's just that it wouldn't be listed as a potential topic here underneath our objectives, possible topics that we would discuss. So you're welcome to take a look at these. I highly recommend combining as opposed to adding. But if you feel we're missing something, you're welcome to add. And if the fact that I've just told you that data citations dropped off and you feel like it's got to go in there, go ahead and put it in. And then the third thing that we talked about at the last plenary was outcomes. This one had the least amount of content in it from the plenary. Just one person provided information. And I did take their items nearly a verbatim. So this will need a little bit more work. And what I'd like to do is make this more the type of outcomes as opposed to what the exact outcomes will be. And there in the timeline, we'll be able to actually be more specific. So let me walk you down a little bit further. The guidance that was given to me was, don't overload this document. Only put in what you need to get the community of practice approved. So I actually was not going to fill in the adoption plans, although I suspect we could, based on that guidance. So I've left that one blank. The operational mechanism, there are some recommended elements that they're asking for. So I have them listed here, but I'll fill those in for further review after this meeting. So don't focus here, but let me pull you down to actually up. Let's go to engagement. This is where Mark's talk really hit strongly for me, is how we will engage. His comments from Lynn and Aaron. So there are some standard questions here that I was working on answering. Some of them are dependent on the collection of information groups and efforts from our ESCSIG. So those are identified. But then a little further down, I pulled out the engagement having to do, especially with the relationship with ESIP and frankly, any other national group that would want to collaborate on the community of practice, would be how we would like to work locally and globally. I think that should be articulated here, of course, with attribution to the poster authors. And then also, I felt it's important that we identify very clearly that we only are as good as the contributions that come in, and it is everyone should know that their ideas will be tracked and given attribution. Oops. I see the word credit. I'm going to, because of lengthy conversations with Mark about the word credit, I'm going to just say appropriate attribution for both individuals and organizations. I hope you're laughing, Mark. And I'm
Shelley, just interrupting to give you a 5-minute warning for the end of the session.
Okay. And then the other thing I want to highlight before we leave, I talked to you about outcomes, I talked to you about engagement, and the other thing to highlight for this particular conversation is there are no decisions on who the co-chairs are. That's up in the air. And the criteria for a community of practice co-chair is more specific. We need to have representation. Well, we have representation all the way around the world for our IG. We just have to be further represented. So, but it's not a given that the co-chairs for the IG will want to actually become co-chairs for the community of practice. Of course, there's an opportunity to do that, but if anybody else wanted to jump in as a co-chair, that would certainly be welcome for consideration. And it matters which country you're from. So, for instance, I think we have multiple. We have two people from the US who are IG co-chairs. We may want to consider that and try to have a little bit more geographical diversification. And so that's an opportunity. And then I list down here, and Susan, just to warm up your finger for the mute button, I notionally, and Kirsten's on here for Coptus as well, I notionally listed potential organizations that might want to provide a letter of support for the community of practice. I have not had any formal conversations with any of these organizations. So I'm, for those of you who are on the call, I absolutely have not. But if this is something that warms your heart, great, we can keep talking. If this is something that gives you ujita, then we should still talk, but I certainly respect that. Okay, that is my walk through this version of the, they call it an agreement as opposed to a charter, by the way. So that's why it says agreement up there, the community of practice agreement. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Hands are raised. Hello, Leslie, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to put my hand up. I must have.
Okay, all right. Susan, that puts you up.
Sure. I was just going to quickly respond, and absolutely, a letter of support. Happy to do that. For everyone, I mean, Shelley and I have had a couple conversations about this. I had a great time at International Data Week. I felt very much at home, right? So and I love that the presentations about the crossover between ESIP and RDA came from community members, not from me, right? Because organizations like this these kind of efforts have to be organic and at that community level. So from where I sit, I try and think about what are the things that we can do in ESIP to make this kind of collaboration more natural, right? Make it easier, make it more obvious that, of course, when a cluster has an amazing output, they say, oh, okay, and then how do we what's the next step? How do we socialize it even further? And RDA through the community of practice, let's go, right? And that it's easy. For me, it's about leveraging the strengths of 2 or 3 or more, leveraging the strengths of whatever organization you're looking at partnering with, right? And leveraging, in this case, the different audiences, the expanded audience of RDA, and then also avoiding duplication of effort, right? Like nobody has time to duplicate effort. And so with this group, I mean, I'm thrilled to see if we had 40 people in this session. It was the most popular session in this time block, I let you know. Are you all out there just listening, or do you want to get involved, right? And because this can't be only on staff, it can't be RDA staff and ESIP staff pulling the effort forward, right? We have limited travel budgets. I get one international trip a year, and it won't always be to RDA where I can go. So we fully support the effort. We want to know what we can do institutionally to make it more organic, to make it happen easier, maybe, with less, just make it more natural. So those are kind of some of my thoughts. The other thing we've seen in ESIP lately is that our cluster outputs are not always formal, right? We're seeing a trend where clusters are wrestling with things, and they're exploring things, and they're sharing information, but there isn't always like a signed, sealed, delivered stamp of approval thing. So how will that impact the sharing nature? So just sharing that as food for thought. So that was just my 2 cents, Shelley. But absolutely happy with the letter of support, and happy to support in any way we can.
That means a lot to me. Thank you very much. And I'm putting in the link for anybody who wants to join the is it the IG? No, it actually is the community of practice. You can either join the RDA mailing group for the community of practice, or the IG. We'll make sure both of those groups are up to date on what we're doing. When we get a little bit further with the draft, which honestly only needs a little bit more time before it's ready to go out for more serious review, then everyone will get a chance to do the review. And that gets us a little further down the lane to figure this out. And I think we are at time. If anyone had questions and wanted to ask them, and they weren't answered, I saved the chat And you're certainly welcome to pop your questions in and or reach out to Christina or Leslie or myself or anyone else that was a speaker. Thanks everyone for coming.